Do you want your business to grow faster? Are you open to new and out-of-the-box ways to drive revenues and increase value? How do you imagine the most successful entrepreneurs and business leaders double, triple, or expand their businesses tenfold or more? The answer is Deals. This is a weekly podcast featuring conversations with business owners, executives, and leaders as we reveal behind-the-scenes details that give you, our listeners, the confidence to pursue your own deal-driven growth. On this show, we discuss a huge variety of deals, everything from large, complex mergers and acquisitions, capital raising, joint ventures, strategic alliances, real estate, affiliate and sponsorship deals, franchising, and more. My name is Corey Kupfer, and I've been supporting deal-driven growth for businesses for over 35 years as a successful entrepreneur, professional negotiator, and attorney. My goal is to help you strategize, plan for, find, and complete deals that will help your company grow faster. Welcome to the DealQuest Podcast. Let's get started. Dr. Greg Waller advises clients on complex business valuation and buy-side and sell-side M&A transactions. He is the son of a blue-collar entrepreneur and was raised and now owns his family industrial painting equipment distribution company. He owned and operated an industrial painting company that specialized in painting elevated structural steel infrastructure like bridges and tanks. Wow. He's also been a partner in a real estate development firm and until recently was a partner in a restaurant operating group. He holds a PhD in finance from Purdue University and until May of 2025 was a tenured professor at Virginia Commonwealth University. He has also taught courses and published research on corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and corporate governance. He's the managing partner of Cornerstone Valuation and a partner and managing director of Transact Capital. Given his academic and entrepreneurial background, he jokingly refers to himself as the blue-collar scholar. I am so excited to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Greg.
Thanks, Corey. Glad to be here.
Well, so Greg, listen, I want so much in just even that bio and your background, and it's not going to be any mystery to my listeners on why and views on why I have you on the show. But before we get into all that experience and the entrepreneurial journey and the deal journey, I want to take you back to when you were a little kid growing up, maybe 10, 12 years old. What did you want to be? Because I'm guessing that a M&A professional and valuation person and former professor, I don't know, were any of those on your radar when you were younger?
Absolutely not. It's funny you ask that because when I was a kid, my father had started this equipment distribution company, and he actually ran it out of the garage of our house when he first started it. In the early days, he used to deliver equipment to customers like all over the place. So he'd have customers painting bridges in places like Dubuque, Iowa, and Helena, Arkansas, along the Mississippi River. And he used to take me on those trips with him. And so when I was around that age, I really kind of wanted to be a truck driver because I'm old enough to remember like CB radios.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so I would listen to these CB radios, and I thought it was really cool to be a truck driver because I put a lot of miles under my belt when I was a kid, and I thought it was pretty cool. But as I quickly got off of that as I got older. But back in those days, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Did you have a handle?
I probably did. I don't even
You don't remember?
I don't even remember what it was. I know my father's was coffee cup because he used to drink coffee like all the time. So.
Okay. Yeah, I remember those days. What was it Breaker, right?
Oh man, yeah, it was crazy.
I love it.
Yeah, I'm dating myself a little bit, but
well, I'm older than you, so I definitely remember those times that it was like, it wasn't just. There was a stretch for those listeners and viewers who are younger. It was a stretch back then. Yeah, it was a way to communicate these CB radios with truckers and things like that. But then it became like a thing where it became just popular among people. Like people would, I don't know, it was almost like, maybe it was the audio app that was hot during the pandemic, Clubhouse. It was almost like, whether you look at it as like a party line or which young people may not know, or like a Clubhouse. It was like a way people just talk to each other over audio,
Yeah. Yeah, it was those were the old days.
Exactly. One more question looking back. What was your first deal of any type? Could be something early in your career or when you were much, as a kid or something, anything you consider a deal.
Yeah, so the first deal that I did was when I was a kid. When I turned 16, my father had this great idea that I was going to earn my allowance basically, and so he had this company that distributed industrial painting and sandblasting equipment, and so he hooked me up with. He and I together put together a sandblast unit and an airless spray pump, and he would get calls from customers to his shop and people asking, hey, do you do boat trailers and lawn furniture? So he used to kick all that work over to me. There was a tool that came out at one point that sandblasted the inside of pipe. And I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio, which was a big steel manufacturing area. And there was a big pipe yard not too far from where my father's place was. And I made my way through the gate of the security place and went out to the pipe yard, and I found these guys sitting in a job trailer, and I was like, I had a piece of 4-inch pipe, and I sandblasted and kind of coated the outside and inside of of half of it, and I left the other half rusty. And I went in there, and I was like, guys, look, you got a whole yard full of this. And I showed them this rusty pipe, and I flipped it around. I said, I can do this to your pipe. And they ended up giving me the whole yard of pipe to blast over about a 1.5 year period. So that was my first deal, and that's kind of what got me into the industrial painting business.
How old were you when you did that?
I was 17.
Okay, love it.
Yeah, I was 17. So I would go down there after school. I hired 2 guys, and I would go down there after school. They worked a 3 to 11 shift, and I would work in the afternoons and go down there and sandblast pipe.
All right, so we go from sandblasting pipe to getting a PhD in finance, right? And then getting into the entrepreneurial and M&A space. Take us a little, just take us along that journey from right now you're 17 and and you have your first deal / business there. Where do you go from there?
Yeah, so the first job kind of set me up to start doing bigger projects. And I started doing elevated structural steel, like bridges and water tanks and radio transmission towers. I've been doing that for several years, and the industry went through some changes. In the old days, they used to use lead-based paint on everything, right? And so we would sandblast that stuff off, and in the old days, we didn't know any better. We'd be blowing it into the river, or to the side of the road.
No covering, no mask, no respirator.
Nobody knew, right? We would dust off our hands and eat lunch, and that was it. When the EPA started coming in and putting regulations on lead-based paint removal, the industry got kind of really crazy. And so I was like kind of floating around between getting in or, staying in or getting out. And I remember I was on a job. I had to fire some guys actually. And so I was actually on the job working one day with this guy. I'm 58. So he was probably my age, but he looked like a lot older. But his hands were all cracked from years of working painting bridges, and he was sitting on the scaffold underneath of the bridge, and we're above the river, and he says to me, he said, look at my hands, look at my face, like, what are you doing? You're a smart boy, why don't you go back to school? I was like, it took me the rest of that season. I ended up getting out of the painting business. I kept some of my equipment as rental equipment, but I got out of the painting business. I went back to school, and I ended up doing my MBA. And when I was in my MBA program at Ohio University, a few of the faculty people there said, hey, you got promise. So like, why don't you think about a PhD? I was like, are you crazy? Like, why would I ever want to do a PhD? And then they were like, well, it's a good lifestyle. And I had been doing some real estate development while I was in grad school. And this was around right after, it was in the early 2000s. So the late 90s, early 2000s. So I ended up doing the PhD at Purdue. They talked me into it. I didn't want to go back into the family business at the time. Didn't want to get back into the painting business. So I was like, yeah, let me check out this thing for a while. So I ended up getting into grad school. Into the PhD program. And I remember I got myself in, and like the first day of school, I was like, what in the heck did I get myself into? Because it was like all this mathematics, right? It's a pretty quantitative program. But yeah, I got through the program and then ended up taking faculty positions and doing the academic gig for a while. While I was doing the academics, I was doing business valuation as an expert witness, and kind of ad hoc, keeping the university position as well.
Love it. I want to go. I love that conversation you said. Sitting right with the guy with the hands. It reminds me. I was out to dinner with a client who has built a very, very successful wealth management firm. He's a somewhat newer client. We've done a bunch of stuff together, but we didn't this is the first time we really just had time at dinner. We didn't talk business at all, right? We just his background was, he told me that he worked for the phone company, right? For years, for like 10 years. And, he was stringing, phone lines, right? Up on the poles and that kind of stuff, right? And it was somewhat similar story in that it was a guy who said, you're young, you're smart, like, what are you doing? And he's like, Coleman was happy. He wasn't like dissatisfied. He's like, well, this is a good life. He like me came from like a low middle class background. You got a job, you're making some money. It's, whatever. And the guy said to him, do me a favor. So this was not on the job. It was like off the job, like at a dinner or something. And when the guy asked him, what he did, he was sort of surprised that he said he worked for a telephone company. He said, do me a favor. When you go back to work, take a look at the folks that are working there that are 10 years older than you. Just take a good look at them. Make a decision if this is what you want to do for the next decade plus, right? And he actually did that. And he was like, no, I don't want to be like him. I don't want to be like him. I don't like that life. Change professions and originally go, for him, it was through the insurance end and then into wealth management. And now he's an entrepreneur like you are, like I am. Runs a phenomenally successful firm and he's committed to leadership and training or whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with being, with working for the phone company or whatever. Clearly his destiny was beyond that. And it took somebody, whether it's the hands of, the guy that you're studying with, or it's the look 10 years at these other people to have that shift. So it's, it's fascinating.
I think having had that, the hard work kind of background, though, really makes you appreciate the education. And it gave me the ability, I think, to be able to talk to people at all different levels. Like I'm as comfortable talking to the janitor as I am to, board of directors. And just being able to put yourself in those shoes and having done it, I think really gives you a different perspective.
Well, folks, you understand that the blue-collar scholar comes from somewhere. It's not just a made-up thing. There's definitely a reason for that. Okay, so now you're in academics, right? Okay, you're doing some expert witness testimony evaluation stuff there. I mean, we know each other through Entrepreneurs Organization, right? So there's professors are not, entrepreneurs generally, right? But obviously you were already doing so much real things like the real estate investment, right? And doing some of the stuff on the side. How did you evolve into, becoming, an entrepreneur?
Yeah. So when I was in my MBA program, I was doing real estate development projects. And I remember when I got to West Lafayette, Indiana for my PhD at Purdue, I actually rented, I probably had a little bit more money than the average doctoral student. I rented a pretty cool townhouse on the other side of the river. And I remember the real estate relocation agent lady that helped me find it said her office was right next door to the place I ended up renting. And she had a lady in there, an older lady, who drove up in this big Rolls Royce. And her husband, I guess, had like one of the biggest insurance agencies in Lafayette, Indiana. And so we're talking, we're chit-chatting, and the lady asked me, she said, what brings you to Lafayette? And I said, I'm here for my PhD in finance. And she goes, oh, honey, you're a salesman. You're not a professor. That was like, well, maybe that's a Harvard-er or something, right? So while I was in my PhD program, I was doing real estate development and got out. I always had my hand in something, right? And CMA had some insight into my soul. So when I took my first academic position at Ohio University, my full-time academic position at Ohio University, I was doing valuation work and some consulting work in addition to the academic gig. And then in 2011, I came to Richmond, Virginia for a faculty position at Virginia Commonwealth University. About a year after I got here, I met a guy who had Cornerstone Valuation, who had started it back in the 80s and was looking at getting out. And we had a mutual acquaintance that introduced us, and we thought it was a pretty good fit. So I was running the valuation practice, and he had really kind of focused mainly on tax filing and valuations for tax purposes, gift taxes, some lost profit stuff. I bought the practice. I began through an earnout, buying the practice off of him and started migrating it more into M&A advisory. So I was kind of balance out the revenue streams between the pure valuation work and the M&A advisory. And so that's kind of how I got into it. And it just got to a point where, over the years, I'd been in academics. I left academics in 2025 and was in Richmond at VCU for 14 years. And then I was at Ohio University before that. I had about 20 years of academics under my belt, and I thought that, it was time to focus full time on the practice. And kind of concurrently with all of that, I ended up buying that company my father had. I became my father's exit plan. So I bought the company off my father and kept that distribution company up in Ohio running, and it's still running today.
I'm guessing you don't need to do a lot on that, on your father's former company.
No, I've got a good team up there. My father's still up there. I know we just recently brought my mother down to Richmond, but I've got family up there. So I go up there, regularly. Technology is great. You can do quite a bit of stuff. And we're doing a lot of stuff remotely, but I make my trips up there and got a great team in place.
So it's interesting, right? I mean, listen, obviously there are a lot of M&A advisory folks out there, right? Different industries, different size of deals, different, et cetera. So I do want to talk about where you focus with it, but before I even get there, and I've had a number on those podcasts, and obviously since I do M&A every day, we deal with, higher level investment bankers or sometimes, brokers on small deals. But I don't know that I've had any of them that have 20 years of academics, one, or two, that I'm at least aware of. I guess maybe there's one or two I'm aware of came from a more blue collar background or whatever. But how do those factors, how does, your life's journey influence and the way you do the M&A advisory side? And what do you think, the fact that you use that phrase, blue collar scholar, right, is, tells me that that's part of your value proposition, right?
Yeah,
So
for
talk
sure.
about that differentiator.
Yeah, I think that just kind of given my background and having been under the hood of a lot of companies through owning and operating them and having worked in them and through the valuation practice, quite honestly, I've been under the hood of like companies in pretty much any industry you can possibly imagine. The combination of having taught valuation, having taught M&A advisory, and then actually doing the practice as well, I think it just gives me anyway, a perspective that a lot of folks might have. So I can look at things from a like different angles from the operator side and kind of get in the head of the seller, maybe more so than folks who come through a traditional analyst, associate, VP kind of progression through the investment banking world.
Yeah. Yeah. So, tell us a little bit more about what specific industries, deal size, that kind of stuff. Give us a little more detail on where you focus.
Yeah, so I like to, whenever I talk about M&A, I like to think about it like this. In my mind, I think there are basically two pools of buyers, right? You've got what I call professional buyers, which would be private equity firms or strategic firms, and then you've got owner operators.
Yeah.
The process that you use to appeal to these two different audiences is vastly different, as you well know, right? And so, owner operator side, when you're appealing to that market, you're often leading with price. It's more of I want to say, a generic market making process in the sense that you're putting it out on Axial or Biz by Sell or your website, hanging a price on it. There are plenty of advisors that really excel in that space. I think where we add value is through a more structured process. So we like to say that our enterprise value target range is 10 to 200 million, somewhere in that range. But, in that more structured process, you've got a more rigorous due diligence process, it's just a more like project management kind of process, really, to get a company from A to Z through the process. And so I think we can add value there just by virtue of the fact that we obviously know the numbers well. We understand the process, and we can go out and create that competitive auction process for our clients.
Yeah. So great. So so lower middle to middle, through middle market
Yeah.
size, and then industry agnostic, or is there space you focus in?
Yeah.
Uh,
So I've got a team behind me. We're
yeah.
20 people strong here, and our key verticals are human resource companies, staffing companies, industrials, and the infrastructure companies, which is kind of like my sweet spot, healthcare, tech, and consumer products. So, and when we do, given the fact that we're in kind of the heart of the military industrial complex, in Richmond, we're kind of triangulated between DC and Norfolk and that whole area. We come across quite a bit of government contracting as well, too.
Sure. Sure. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about, I think in the last podcast recording, I was joking with the guest about how, the journey is always smooth and every deal works out and it's all easy, right? Of course not. Oh,
I haven't found one yet.
exactly. Exactly. In fact, it's funny because I think almost universal wisdom with anybody I know is in the field, they like the smaller deals, which should be easier, tend to actually be the most trouble. And then the worst thing you can get is when you get a client that says, "Yeah, should be a simple deal." Like that's like the curse,
Yeah, you're jinxing it before you start.
So let's go to. I mean, listen. Obviously, you built a great firm. You have an amazing background. You have a great team. You got plenty of your deals that go really well. All right. Let's though talk about the ones that haven't gone well, whether it's any of your personal investment, stuff, whether it's real estate development or other companies, or as a professional, because, I think there's a lot of instruction people can learn from the ones that have trouble.
Yeah, I think the ones that have trouble, we'll just focus on the M&A deals, right? I think it's all about setting expectations before you get into the process, right? So coming from a pure valuation background, I can look at companies and tell you the value, but I always stress to clients that there's a difference between value and price. The example I've been using recently, it's getting a little bit dated now, but was like that whole GameStop thing, right? Where the price went through the roof, and then when the market realized that nothing fundamental changed about the company, the stock price dropped. Just setting those expectations is really important in the beginning of the process. So when we look at a company that we're going to take to the market, I'll give my best guess estimate on a range of values with the understanding that, look, if this thing ends up pricing at the lower end of the range, are we still good to go? With the understanding that, look, we're all incentivized to try to maximize the price that we can bring in the market. Where I've had problems is when there's a disconnect between the expectations that I've set and what the client actually acknowledges. So it's like,
Let's take a break from the show for a minute so I can tell you about an incredible resource my team and I have put together for you. Secrets of Deal-Driven Growth, Creative Ways to Grow Your Business Even in Challenging Times, is a powerful ebook that helps you take DealQuest podcast episodes and apply them to your own life and business. This is the ideal tool for anyone looking for creative ways to grow as deal makers, and you can get yours now. It's as easy as heading to coreykupfer.com/workbook and downloading your copy. While you're there, you can also consider joining our dynamic deal-driven community of founders, experts, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. Now back to the show.
It's easy to say, hey, Waller, look, you looked at this thing, you're a valuation guy, you told me it was worth X, and like the market's coming back and it's not pricing it accordingly. So I always really have to stress whenever I set those expectations that, listen, this is my estimate of what it's going to make it bring in the market, and I can't really dictate what the market's going to do.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I mean, listen, it's almost sort of accepted knowledge, especially if you're talking about owner operators who've run the business for a long time. It's easy for them to overvalue. I mean, when they say things to me like, "I've been running this for 40 years," I'm pretty straightforward. I'm like, a buyer does not care whether you've been running it for 40 years or 30 years or 20 years or 3 years, other than there could be some brand value because of the length of time or whatever. I'm not saying that it doesn't, but if your numbers are X, right? Your numbers are X. And by the way, if you've been running it 40 years and there's been a downturn and that's why you're getting out now, right? Maybe the last 10 years or 5 years that you've gone down is actually a detriment, right? Nobody pays based upon the amount of work you put in to get it started and to run it over whatever, 5 or 10 or 15 years or whatever it is you've done, or more you've done it.
Yeah, I actually had this conversation yesterday with a client about, the goodwill of the company. He's like, well, we've been in business for this company's been in business for 75 years. How would you value the goodwill? And I was like, guys, look, goodwill is going to manifest itself in cash flows, right? To the extent that you have good brand equity, to the extent that you have good customer relationships, it's going to translate into cash flows. And if the cash flows aren't there, then there's no value to the goodwill. I mean, technically, a goodwill from an accounting perspective is like, a lot of clients don't understand the difference between accounting goodwill and like equity, what they're calling goodwill, right? But when you try to price that out, it's like, well, look, it should show up in the cash flows, right? Then to the extent that it shows up in the cash flows, it's valuable.
Yeah, and the interesting part, I guess the corollary to that is if it doesn't show into the cash flow, but the buyer does see value in the brand equity, then they're going to say, that's part of the reason we're buying this thing, because the seller has not leveraged that brand equity in ways that we can see they can do it. But the buyer's still not going to pay you for that because they're the ones who have to go do it. You didn't do it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, of course, from the sell side, right, we're going to try to pitch that and say, listen, there's great brand equity here, right? And that's part of our job is to try to show buyers that there is like the goodwill that can be monetized, but shrewd buyers are going to recognize the cash flows at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And listen, if they really think they can blow this thing up and whatever, 4 or 5 turns on a multiple, eventually, if you have a good representative on the sell side and, you're not going to get that for it, but maybe you can get a turn extra, right?
Yeah.
They'll give you a little piece of it because they know that, they are going to leverage it. But yeah, that's where the negotiation comes in.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, and then, and how you get that turn is another matter, right? How they structure that thing is another matter, right? They're liable not, it's likely that they're not going to write a check for it. You're going to see it as an earn out or something like that, some contingent type payment.
Well, listen, there is the classic old joke in whether it's M&A professional lawyers, with give me a price, I'll give you a deal structure. Give me a deal structure, I'll give you a price. Like I can come up with a deal structure that will meet anybody's price. You want 10 times what your company's worth? Okay. I'll pay you over 100 years without, you're like, I'm making an extreme here, right? And there'll be these 25 contingencies that if you don't, whatever it is, right? A lot of buyers do this in certain industries where they, present the total purchase price, right? Well, that includes the cash up front, includes back-end cash that might be guaranteed, includes maybe cash that's subject to retention, which obviously if you don't retain clients, right? Includes earnouts, which have growth CAGRs. So should that really be part of the total, right, purchase price put out? Includes equity, which sometimes you like, how the hell did they value, this rollover equity, right? So I love when, clients say, well, I'm getting 45 million, total purchase price. I'm like, okay, what are the components? How much of that is guaranteed? How much of that you get up front, right? How much of that is contingent upon a growth CAGR you're not going to meet?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's tricky because sometimes when we look in the databases to try to price companies, a lot of that gets masked. So you might see these
Yeah.
high multiples, and it doesn't really give you any detail on how the structure was set up.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Talk to me a little bit, because I run into this, and I think it's something that's less talked about, right? Obviously, you're going to do the financial analysis, all the due diligence, whatever. But when you deal with entrepreneurs, I'm not talking about professional sellers, right? I'm not talking about PE firm, selling one of its portfolio companies, or a firm that's grown and brought in significant professional management, right, before it sells. If you're talking about, an owner operator or a few partners that started the business, created something good, talk to me a little bit more about, because like I find there are personality, psychological, all of these things, it's their baby. I mean, just as an example, I give this before, we got a deal closed once. I was representing the buyer, and everything seemed to be going great. And then suddenly the deal stalled, right? And there was no seemingly logic on it. And what I determined was the guy, he was like well into, I don't know, he was like, I think he was like 82 already or something, right? I just got clear that the guy just couldn't totally give it up. And he also, frankly, didn't want to be home doing nothing. And we solved it by letting the guy keep it office and giving him a title of a chairman emeritus. No duties, no, didn't own anything, had no say, but
Right.
he got to say he was chairman emeritus and he had a place to go, right? So
Yeah.
it's those kind of things that I'm sort of asking about, because like people are people and we can do all the analytics we want, but if you wouldn't be great at what you do if you weren't able to deal with the human element as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, they're all kind of crazy things. We had a company in the market that was a big steel fabrication and steel erection company. And I mean, this was a pretty profitable company. They were in the $10 million EBITDA range, right? And they had a couple really nice offers, and the owner kept moving the goalpost. It was like, I want 80% cash at close. And then I want then he kept moving. And so initially it was like, okay, this is what we're looking for. And we had indications of interest, and we took them to him, and he was like, well, the numbers are a little bit low. It's like, okay. So we kept digging. We got the number up, and then he didn't like the structure. And it was like, well, I need 80% cash or 85% cash. I forget what it was. It was like some crazy number. I need that much cash. And so we ultimately did find somebody who was willing to pay like 85% cash at close. And we got that deal done. But he kept moving the goalposts until he was like finally ready to say, okay, I got it. But the other thing that I run into it a lot in that regard is like you talk to a business owner, they might be taking quite a bit of cash out of a company, right? And they're getting ready to sell the company, and they're like, well, I could like hang on to the company for a few more years and make that much money. And like what I try to explain to them is like the concept of the time value of money, right? A dollar today is worth more than a dollar tomorrow, right? And so I don't know that they always get that concept, because in their mind, it's like, well, if I'm pulling X out of this company this year, if I do that for 3 more years, it's like, that's a bunch of money that I'm leaving on the table, and try to explain it. And it's impacted in the sale price of the company. You can't think about it like that.
Not to mention that equivalent money that's coming out to them over those 3 years as ordinary income, as opposed to the far majority will be capital gains. Also, that's very different in terms of net.
Yeah, no kidding. So, yeah, so and you run into those things. There are ways that there are little delay tactics that owners might throw at you, but honestly, a good part of this business isn't finance related, right? It's psychology related, right? Managing expectations, and that's why we really try to make sure that we have clients that are ready to go beforehand, so that when it comes time to close, it's we don't run into some of these issues.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I've been doing this for 40 years now, which is crazy. Like that number. There's so much more resources. Not only, I mean, it used to be for a while, and now sort of low middle market to middle market space has gotten some better players in it. But it used to be that you had the high end investment bankers, and then you had your Main Street brokers, right? It wasn't a lot in the middle. I think technology and other things have helped enable it, and people saw a gap in the marketplace. But also, there wasn't. I mean, exit strategy, exit consulting, like that whole industry where there's all kinds of people who do that. Some of them, are
Yeah.
M&A folks. Some of them aren't even M&A folks. They hand it over to M&A, right? That didn't exist either. I mean, we would come in as lawyers sometimes in the early days, especially if there wasn't a banker involved or a broker involved. And we'd be like, okay, forget the timing and finding, and you have this, whatever. We need 6 months to clean this business up. It's a freaking mess. There's not even that, not only financially, you can't find contracts, you don't know whatever, you clear if the employees are going to stay on. Everything's a mess, right?
Oh, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think one of our value adds is that we take a very consultative approach with our clients, and so some of our best deals were 3 or 5 years in the making, where we got in early, we did some valuation work, identified value drivers, and it might have started with a conversation like, "Hey, I'm thinking about gifting stock to my kids," and I come in on a valuation engagement, and then the conversation kind of morphed to, "Hey, look, maybe we're actually thinking about selling this thing," and we have the conversations like, well, thinking about going to the market, there are some things that you're going to want to get cleaned up, and working with the clients over, a number of years. And when they're finally ready to pull the trigger, we're their first call because we've worked with them for the past couple of years, helping them get their house in order. And then it's a relatively easy process to get it packaged up to go to the market. And so we really like those kind of engagements. It's a good way to segue into that transition and get all your ducks in a row before you're going to go. I always tell clients like the best time to start thinking about when to hit the market is 3 years ago. It's like you make sure you're ready to go.
Yeah, I love that. So when you do on sell side, are the buyers more often, or is it a mix, financial buyers or strategic buyers or both?
That line is like getting so blurry now.
Well, that's true as well, right?
It's getting really, really blurry. I would say that the majority of the buyers for our companies are private equity backed platforms that kind of act like strategics. So yeah, that's kind of what it boils down to. So we did a transaction earlier this year that was in the water and infrastructure space, and the acquiring company was HIG backed company. It was a big company, and but they acted a lot like a strategic, right? So they were bolting on competitors essentially. Yeah.
Right, because they're P back, so
Yeah.
that's strategic buyers, right? Exactly.
Yeah, that's the large majority of our the buyers for our companies. Now we're getting ready to close one. I mean, the papers have already been signed on it, but it should be funded next week. And that acquirer is a European pure strategic, not private equity backed pure strategic
Got it.
buyer. Yeah. So
I always love doing deals with international. I mean, there's more complications, different customs, different approaches. I remember, I mean, there's several of these. I've told the story before, but I think it's been a long time. I had a very early learning when I was a summer associate. So I wasn't even a lawyer yet. I was working in a law firm in between my second and third year of law school. There was a huge acquisition deal it was with a Japanese buyer. We were representing the seller. And we had actually I was at a big firm in New York City. So they hired a cultural consultant. And, especially back, I mean, it's still important today, but back then when there was less in terms of the internet and awareness of different
sure.
practices, he told us, okay, well, when they hand you their business card, you don't just take it and stick it in your pocket, whatever. You got to take it with both hands. You got to look at them, acknowledge them. It's the calling card. You put it down in front and like, okay, that deal, like everything was going smoothly until it came to signing. And then there was this uproar in Japanese, and we're all sitting there. And like I said, I'm a student, like, so I'm sitting on the sidelines making copies, right? I'm like, what's going on? But I saw the partners were a little like, whatever. So I'm like, turns out that the consultant had forgot to tell us that we needed to get nice pens, because what the Japanese do is that they have a pen that they sign the deal with, and then they don't use it for anything else, to memento of the deal. And we just had regular pens. So they had to send somebody out to buy, at the time, was before the Mont Blancs. And so they, like, just to the cross pen store, to the stationery store to buy some nice cross pens. So I've had everything from that to remembering a deal with the Germans, where the Germans like literally initial every page of every, and this is back in the days where it was war copy in a conference room, no digital, and there were thousands and thousands of pages, and every signer had hand initial every single page, not to mention the time when the minister from the Philippines was in the room talking about his cut of the deal that my client was doing. And I'm like, we can't have this conversation. This is a violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I like the challenges and interesting learnings of international deals. I don't know how many of them you do, but
Yeah, yeah. It's like the first thing that we always try to get clarified is like, what accounting standards are we working on? And, like where's the legal going to get done? And, so they're interesting deals. They add, one of the things in this deal that we're wrapping up now, one of the interesting things I noticed was, so the company's European, like the different expectations for salaries. So like the folks in the US were making, for our client, were making significantly more money than like the top people at the European company. And so how we had to structure some of those key players pay packages, it was an interesting discussion, because we got a sales guy that's making 2 times what the CEO of the other company's making. So it's like,
yeah,
we got to be careful with that one.
yeah.
That was an interesting wrinkle.
Yeah, that's pretty common, right? Pay
Yeah.
raise, or at the same time, in a lot of these European countries, it's impossible to fire anybody, and you pay them for extended leaves, and you're, like it's, so it's, there's a lot of interesting things there. All right, before we get to my final two questions, just give me, like, what are you seeing in the marketplace? I mean, obviously, that's a big question. Different sectors and geographies and industries are different. It's such an interesting time. I mean, without getting into any of the politics of it, there's just so many sort of, the stock market's, been closer, hitting record highs, right? People, say affordability in the surveys is the biggest issue that supposedly affected the interim election results. Get interest rates that are come down, but not as quickly as maybe some others, would like. Inflation, jobs have been mixed. Like, what are you seeing out there? And then, on the one hand, in some segments, I know it feels like there's a lot of PE money still out there,
Yeah.
dry powder, sitting out there. So what are you seeing in the segments that you do in terms of, what's going on, and with the caveat that none of us have a crystal ball and who knows what could happen? What do you see for 2026?
Yeah, so probably up until about April, I thought that this year, 2025, is going to be a total write-off with all the turmoil in the markets, right? I would say around midsummer, like the tide kind of started to shift for us. So things started really kind of opening up July, August of this year. We're not going to see 2% interest rates anymore. So I think that the market has settled in on reasonable required rates of return for debt financing. That's part of it. And I've seen a lot of activity in companies that are labor intensive, right? Because with the immigration policies, as they are, like labor is a big problem. So I've got service providers to the infrastructure industry. They're getting gobbled up for really high multiples, because part of the thing is, acquirers are looking for skilled labor, people that know what they're doing. We're seeing the same thing in a lot of our staffing deals, right? So staffing deals are, human resource driven. I think that those industries are doing really, really well, and you combine that with the fact that I think that there's a lot of pent up demand on the part of private equity to deploy funds. They're sitting on a massive amount of dry powder. 2024 wasn't a great year for M&A activity, I don't think. And so you kind of see the ingredients for a really robust market coming out, right? I think the market has kind of taken some of the stuff that's going on as white noise, and I think that they just have to make some investments with the money that they're sitting on. Just as kind of a point of comparison, I have a son who's a managing director they're not a bulge bracket, but they're, upper middle market M&A firm. And he's doing kind of the same space actually as I am, infrastructure and engineering. They're slammed with big deals. I think the indications are that 2026 is going to be a reasonably good year.
Well, hopefully that's the case. Certainly, certainly, keep on. We're busy already, but I think there's a lot of growth potential. We'll see what happens. All righty. If people want to find out more about you and your companies, where do they go?
Yeah, so you can reach me at our website. HG Waller is the first part of that, at transactcapital.com, or HG Waller at Cornerstone-Valuation, VALUATION.com. My mobile number is on there, and people can call, and we'll make sure we get back to them.
Awesome. So my final question, Greg, on the podcast is always about my highest value in life, which is freedom. And for me, that means everything from freedom from around the world for people from oppression to why I've been an entrepreneur for decades and haven't had a boss. What does freedom mean to you, and how does it impact your life and business?
That's a good question. I think freedom is to be able to wake up every day with a clean conscience, to live a life that isn't stressed by monetary or those types of concerns. Yeah, I mean, that's freedom, the ability to chart your own destiny, right? And that's really what's great about the United States. I think, having been around the world, I think that, this is a unique place where, if you work hard and you're smart, you have the ability to do whatever you want to do, and that's really freedom.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Greg Waller, thanks for being such a great guest on the DealQuest podcast.
Thanks so much. It's my pleasure.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of DealQuest, where we help you understand how deal-driven growth can be your ticket to freedom. If you are interested in finding out more about my law firm, the services we provide to entrepreneurial and growing companies across industries all over the country, and my partner Brian Megan and I, and my amazing team, just head over to kupferlaw.com. That's kupferlaw.com. And if you want to follow more of my content, head over to my LinkedIn page where I post regularly. I'm Corey Kupfer. Until next week, wishing you the freedom and financial prosperity that I know your DealQuest will bring.